There is a moment in certain relationships when the confusion lifts, when the emotional fog clears, and you realize that what you have been calling love has actually been endurance. And what you have been offering as compassion has been used as permission. And this moment is not dramatic, it is quiet, but it is life changing. Today, we are talking about a fall that rarely gets discussed. Not the collapse of the empath, but the collapse of the one who underestimated them. The fall that happens when empathy is mistaken for weakness and kindness is treated as an endless resource. Because a super empath is not fragile, they are perceptive, regulated, and deeply self aware. And when they are betrayed, the story does not end the way it usually does. There is no chaos, no revenge, no implosion. There is clarity, there is withdrawal, and there is a power shift that the narcissistic personality never anticipated. And it is in that shift that everything ends. A super empath is often misunderstood because empathy in popular culture is framed as softness or emotional fragility, when in reality, a super empath is someone who has developed a high level of emotional regulation, self awareness, and resilience, usually through lived experience, pain, and deep reflection. This is not someone who feels everything and collapses. This is someone who feels deeply and still functions clearly. They can sit with discomfort without denying it. They can recognize emotional shifts in others because they have spent time understanding their own inner world. And that awareness is what makes them powerful, not vulnerable. A super empath has boundaries, even if they are quiet about them. They are constantly checking in with themselves, noticing when something feels off, when words and actions do not align. When energy shifts, they may give chances not because they do not see the red flags, but because they are assessing context, intent, and capacity for change. This assessment process is often invisible to others, especially to narcissistic personalities who assume that patience equals passivity and understanding equals tolerance without limits. What differentiates a super empath from someone who is simply accommodating is nervous system regulation. They are able to stay calm in emotionally charged situations. They do not need immediate control or validation to feel safe, and this can confuse narcissists who rely on emotional chaos to maintain dominance. The super empath can listen without absorbing blame. They can observe without reacting impulsively, and they can pause instead of engaging in power struggles. This regulation comes from self-knowledge. A super empath knows their values, their triggers, and their limits. They may still hope for growth or accountability in others, but they are not unaware of reality. They are collecting data. And this is where narcissists make their biggest mistake. They assume the empath is unaware when in fact the empath is discerning. Resilience is another core trait. A super empath has usually survived emotional neglect, betrayal, or invalidation earlier in life. And instead of becoming emotionally shut down, they learned how to stay open without losing themselves. That takes strength, not weakness. They know how to rebuild after disappointment, and that ability is deeply threatening to someone who relies on others, breaking down to feel powerful. Because of this inner stability, a super empath does not depend on external approval for identity. They can care deeply and still walk away. They can love and still choose distance when respect disappears. This is why when betrayal occurs, it does not destroy them. It activates their clarity. They move from compassion to self-protection, not out of anger, but out of alignment with who they know themselves to be. This combination of empathy, regulation, and resilience is invisible until it is no longer available, and by the time others realize its value, the super empath has already shifted internally, recalibrating priorities, redefining access, and reclaiming emotional space that was once freely given. Narcissistic personalities operate from a core belief that relationships exist to serve their needs. And when they encounter someone deeply empathetic, they interpret that empathy through a distorted lens. They assume it is an unlimited resource, something that can be drawn from repeatedly without consequence. They confuse compassion with compliance and emotional availability with consent, and this misunderstanding becomes the foundation of their eventual loss. When a super empath listens, tries to understand, and offers emotional patience, the narcissist experiences this as power. They believe they have found someone who will stay, no matter how far boundaries are pushed. Every act of forgiveness is read not as a conscious choice, but as evidence that there are no real limits. And so the narcissist escalates behaviors. More manipulation, more dishonesty, more emotional withdrawal, more testing of loyalty. Because in their mind, the empath's role is to absorb, not to resist. This is where the miscalculation begins, because a super empath's empathy is not rooted in self-abandonment. It is rooted in awareness. They are constantly evaluating whether behavior aligns with stated values, whether accountability follows harm, whether repair is genuine or performative, while the narcissist is busy taking empathy for granted. The empath is quietly registering patterns, and each pattern reduces emotional investment. Narcissists often rely on intermittent reinforcement periods of charm, followed by devaluation to keep others off balance. But this tactic loses effectiveness with someone who is emotionally regulated. The super empath may feel the pain, but they are not destabilized by it. They do not confuse intensity with intimacy, and they do not equate longing with love. This stability is mistaken for endless tolerance, and that mistake encourages the narcissist to go further than they otherwise would. Betrayal becomes the moment of exposure because it shatters the narcissist's illusion of control. They assume that even betrayal will be rationalized, minimized, or forgiven. But betrayal crosses a line that empathy alone cannot bridge, because empathy does not override self-respect for a super empath. Betrayal is information, it clarifies intent, it confirms that harm is not accidental but patterned. At this point, the narcissist expects emotional collapse, pleading, or negotiation. What they get instead is distance, and this is deeply disorienting because they believed empathy guaranteed access. They did not anticipate that empathy could coexist with detachment. The narcissist's loss is not sudden, it is cumulative. It is built on every assumption that the empath would stay indefinitely, every belief that kindness meant weakness, and every escalation that ignored the cost of trust. When the super empath finally withdraws, the narcissist is left confused, not understanding that the very empathy they exploited is what allowed the empath to see clearly and leave without drama, without vengeance, and without return. Betrayal is often framed as something that shatters a person emotionally. But for a super empath, betrayal functions very differently because their inner world is built on reflection rather than denial. When betrayal occurs, it does not create confusion, it creates coherence. Scattered doubts suddenly align into a clear narrative, and this shift is not loud or dramatic, it is internal and irreversible. A super empath has usually spent a long time questioning themselves, minimizing red flags, and offering benefit of the doubt. They ask whether they are being too sensitive, too demanding, or too critical. And this self inquiry is sincere, not self gaslighting, but an attempt to be fair. However, betrayal removes ambiguity. It answers the questions the empath has been holding. And once that answer arrives, the nervous system no longer needs to stay hypervigilant trying to make sense of mixed signals. This is why betrayal activates clarity instead of collapse. The empath no longer expends energy managing emotional dissonance. There is no longer a need to reconcile words with actions or hope with reality. The truth becomes emotionally efficient, and that efficiency creates calm, not chaos. For narcissistic dynamics, this moment is dangerous because clarity disrupts control. Narcissists thrive in confusion, in emotional fog, where reality can be reshaped and accountability avoided. Betrayal eliminates that fog. It reveals intent rather than impact, and intent is what changes everything for a super empath. Once clarity sets in, the empath begins to disengage, not impulsively, but decisively. They stop over explaining. They stop seeking validation for their pain. They stop trying to be understood by someone who benefits from misunderstanding them. This is not emotional shutdown. It is emotional reallocation. Energy that was once invested in repair is redirected towards self-protection and alignment. The collapse that narcissists expect often comes from trauma bonding, panic, bargaining, or fear of abandonment. But a super empath has already processed those fears internally. They have felt the grief before the ending actually happens. So when betrayal occurs, the emotional work is already underway. The external separation simply follows the internal one. This is why the shift feels sudden to the narcissist, but inevitable to the empath. The empath has crossed a psychological threshold where hope no longer overrides self-trust, and once self-trust is restored, manipulation loses its leverage. Clarity also dissolves guilt. The empath no longer feels responsible for managing the other person's emotions or outcomes. They recognize that betrayal was a choice, not a misunderstanding, and that recognition releases them from the cycle of justification and repair. What emerges after betrayal is not bitterness, but decisiveness. The empath does not need revenge because clarity provides closure, and closure is power. It allows them to walk away without needing the narcissist to agree, understand, or admit wrongdoing, and that quiet, grounded exit is what truly ends the dynamic because it leaves no emotional hooks to pull them back in. Emotional detachment in a super empath is often misunderstood as coldness or indifference, when in reality, it is the result of deep internal processing. Once a super empath detaches, it is not impulsive, it is not reactive, and it is not reversible. This detachment happens after repeated attempts at understanding, repair, and boundary setting have failed. And by the time it appears externally, the decision has already been made internally. A super empath does not detach. Suddenly, they detach quietly. Over time. They grieve while still present. They mourn the relationship while still trying. And this means that when detachment finally occurs, the emotional bond has already loosened. They are no longer negotiating with hope. They are acting from clarity and self-respect. What makes this detachment so destabilizing for a narcissist is that it removes emotional access. Narcissists are not sustained by love, but by engagement, reactions, and relevance. They need to feel that they matter, that they can provoke response, admiration, fear, or pain. When a super empath detaches, those responses disappear. The empath is no longer emotionally available to be pulled into arguments, explanations, or cycles of guilt. This detachment is energetic as much as it is emotional. The empath stops scanning for the narcissist's moods, stops adjusting themselves to maintain peace, stops over-functioning in the relationship, and this shift is subtle but absolute. It changes the power dynamic entirely because the narcissist can no longer locate leverage. A super empath who has detached may still be polite or calm, which confuses the narcissist even more because the absence of emotion removes the familiar cues that once signaled control. There is no anger to provoke, no tears to exploit, no reassurance to extract, and without those signals, the narcissist feels invisible. This is where the term unreachable becomes accurate. The empath is physically present, perhaps even communicative, but emotionally closed to manipulation. The narcissist can speak, but their words no longer land. They can attempt to provoke, but the reaction does not come. And this creates an internal collapse for someone who relies on emotional impact to feel powerful. Detachment also means the empath is no longer invested in being understood. They stop correcting the narrative. They stop defending their intentions, and they stop participating in rewriting reality. This withdrawal of engagement is not punishment. It is self-preservation. For the narcissist, this is often more painful than conflict because conflict still provides connection. Detachment provides none. And without emotional access, the narcissist is left facing their own emptiness without an external buffer. Once a super empath reaches this state, there is no return because the nervous system has recalibrated. Safety is no longer associated with the narcissist. And without that emotional bond, the dynamic cannot be revived. The relationship ends not with drama, but with absence. And that absence is the final and most definitive boundary. Narcissistic dynamics are often misunderstood as being driven by power or control, when in reality they are driven by access to attention, validation, emotional reaction, and relevance. Dominance is simply the method, but access is the goal. And this distinction becomes painfully clear when that access is removed. A narcissist does not need to be admired. They need to be central. They need to feel that they matter in someone else's emotional world, whether that emotion is positive or negative, conflict, admiration, fear, or devotion. All serve the same purpose. They confirm existence and importance, and as long as access is available, the narcissist can tolerate almost anything. This is why super empaths are such powerful sources. They are emotionally present, responsive, reflective, and deeply engaged. They offer not just attention, but attunement, and that level of access allows the narcissist to regulate their fragile sense of self through someone else's nervous system. When a super empath withdraws, that access disappears not gradually but completely. Emotional doors close, reactions stop, explanations end, and the narcissist is left speaking into silence. This silence is not the silent treatment, it is the absence of supply, and that absence creates an internal crisis. What many people fail to understand is that narcissists can tolerate loss of status, relationships, or even reputation more easily than they can tolerate irrelevance. They can rewrite stories, vilify others, and recruit sympathy, but they cannot regulate the emptiness that comes from no longer being emotionally impactful. The loss of access removes the narcissist's ability to control the narrative because narratives require an audience. When the empath stops engaging, there is no one left to convince, defend against, or manipulate. The narcissist may escalate with provocation, charm, or victimhood, but without access, none of these tactics land. This is often when narcissists appear most dysregulated because they are facing something they have spent a lifetime avoiding, an internal void that was previously filled by others' reactions. Without access, they are forced to confront themselves, and that confrontation is intolerable. For the super empath, reclaiming access is not about punishment, it is about alignment. They recognize that their emotional presence is valuable and that it must be protected. They stop offering themselves as a resource to someone who exploits without reciprocating. This shift dismantles the dynamic entirely because narcissistic patterns cannot function in the absence of engagement. Control without access is meaningless manipulation. Without reaction, collapses, and the narcissist is left powerless, not because someone overpowered them, but because the source they depended on is no longer available. In this way, the end does not come through confrontation, but through closure. And the narcissist's real injury is not losing the person, but losing the ability to matter in that person's inner world. The idea that a narcissist's downfall comes from exposure, confrontation, or revenge is deeply ingrained, but it misses the psychological reality of how narcissistic dynamics actually end. The true collapse does not occur when the narcissist is attacked. It occurs when they are rendered irrelevant. Narcissists organize their identity around impact. They need to feel seen, reacted to, and centered in someone else's emotional experience. Without that impact, their sense of self destabilizes, and this is why conflict still feeds them. Anger still confirms importance. Even rejection can be reframed as obsession. What cannot be reframed is indifference. For a super empath, irrelevance is not a strategy, it is an outcome. Once emotional detachment is complete, the narcissist no longer occupies mental space. The empath does not monitor their behavior, interpret their motives, or anticipate their reactions. They simply stop factoring them in. And this absence of psychic engagement is devastating to someone who relies on others for self-definition. Revenge keeps the narcissist relevant even when it appears to challenge them. It maintains emotional connection. It sustains the narrative of importance. And the super empath intuitively understands this. They do not seek to win. They seek to be free.